Card gamers who don't like Magic the Gathering often cite lands as the reason why. They say things like, I would like to play my cards, lands are boring, or what the f*** is this? And yeah, lands are weird. But riddle me this, duelists. If lands were as bad as some players think they are, why has Magic the Gathering survived for over 30 years? It's definitely not because the game has become a vehicle for speculative investment using outside intellectual property as an authority indicator to influencers and crypto bros who missed the boat on the last pump and dump of their favorite meme coin. Right? So let's take a deep look at lands, discuss their hidden design virtues and their problems, see if any other game has come up with a better system, or find out if lands are actually brilliant.
Distraction makers.
The first thing that Magic the Gathering's land system does is it injects a large amount of randomness into the game. This obviously is a double-edged sword because the fail state here is so poor, right? It is mana screw or mana flood where you effectively don't get to play the game, but the best parts of the mana system are somewhere in between that, right? Where you're not necessarily able to play all of your spells on curve, and you're thrown into various different scenarios where you're both battling sort of your own deck and the variants therein, and also what your opponent is able to do. This has several benefits that we've discussed on the channel before. One is that it gives newer players an opportunity to defeat more advanced players. This one I actually don't think is the best reason for this system, but it is one that Richard Garfield cites in his book, Characteristics of Games, as more of an ability to allow players in different skill buckets to have meaningful games against each other that they wouldn't otherwise have in less random systems. The other factor is that it creates scenarios that you as an advanced player have to navigate through to victory. The main criticism that always comes up when we talk about randomness in strategy games is that make it so your skill doesn't matter. So just for a minute, let's talk about a thought experiment that can show us how skill can still matter in a game that includes randomness. If we played a game of chess and at the end of the game we flipped a coin and whoever won the coin flip actually wins. And this is an instance where a system has too much randomness. The randomness is weighted much more than what the skill of the chess game is because the outcome of the chess game does not have any influence on the coin flip. So if instead we played the same game of chess and then we rolled a d6 afterward, and on a roll of a 6, the loser of the chess game actually wins. That would mean that the skill in the game of chess still has an impact on the data collection of who is better at the game, but 1 in 6, the randomness is actually the thing that decides. We can think about this as adding noise to the data collection of what is the most optimal strategy and also who is the best player at the game. The next great thing about the land system is that it solves something that's called the queen problem. Richard Garfield theorized that if players could customize their game pieces, what's stopping them from selecting only the best game pieces? Queen problem is referencing queens in chess, so if you could choose any chess pieces for all of your chess pieces, why would you choose anything other than all queens? The land system for Magic solves this in a few different ways. One is that there's a number cost associated with how much something costs. We usually refer to this as like the mana value. So if something costs one generic mana and 2 green, this has a mana value of 3. However, Magic's mana system has much more granularity in these mana costs. Something can cost 1 and 2 black, 3 black, or it can cost 2 and 1 black. And each of these casting costs is harder for you to achieve, right? You have to build your deck in particular ways to gain the ability to play these spells. So one way to look at this is that Magic's mana system actually has 5 different types of resources. Technically 6 or maybe a little bit more if we're counting colorless and snow mana, but whatever. We're just going to look at the main 5 colors of Magic. You get different aspects of the game by being able to cast spells of those different colors. You could theoretically create a system like this that doesn't have these resources in the same deck as the spells, and it would make it so that more consistently you could cast the spells that you wanted to cast. Say if instead of drawing the mana from your deck, you could instead select a number of mana and different colors that you wanted to gain every turn. But we gain something by putting the lands themselves in the deck, right? Not only is it more simple and elegant to have just a single deck of cards, but also you gain a tension in deck building where the cards that you would play to win the game are in direct competition with the cards that are required for you to cast the cards that win the game. If you're trying to play a more aggressive strategy, you're going to want to eliminate some of those resource cards and play lower on the mana curve conserve in order for you to make sure that you're not drawing too many resources and not enough things to kill your opponent. If you're wanting to cast spells that are more powerful and cost more mana, you will want to include more lands in your deck, so it's more likely that you draw a land and can hit your land drops every turn to eventually overpower your opponent with more powerful spells. Another thing that is added by the lands actually being in play and permanents that can be interacted with rather than a sort of system that sits outside of the possibility space of things that you could interact with, it adds a lot of dimensionality to the game, right? It allows an additional vector for your opponents to attack through, for you to attack your opponent's resources, right? You can attack cards in hand, you can attack their creatures, you can attack their lands, but it's definitely something I notice about the pre-modern format where there is quite a bit more attacking of your opponent's resources and the games can feel much more dynamic. Another thing that's really great about lands is that they're distinctly different than other cards that are in your deck. There's a lot of sort of game systems that have tried to solve the land problem by making cards dual purpose. A regular card, but they can also be turned into a resource card. But when lands are a distinctly different type of card, it not only simplifies and chunks the information for players to say, all right, when I look at my opening hand, make sure you have X number of lands. And also there's sort of some decision-making guidance with, okay, I have a land in my hand. All I do is put that into play. That's what that card is for. Instead of having sort of this decision fatigue of which card do I want to turn into one of my resources, that decision is already made for you. And because lands are sort of a distinct type of card, it also means that this gives designers additional design space. The effects that can be put on these types of cards can be explored and have been explored since really early in Magic's creation. With cards like Bazaar of Baghdad, we have things like the Manlands, Dark Depths, and then finally, I think one of the greatest strengths of the mana system in Magic is that there's an immense amount of flexibility. There's sort of this challenge with trading card games, right, where you don't know what game pieces your players will have acquired. And so building a system that allows players to play as many of those cards as possible, even if it's at a disadvantage, right? Because you would then need to, if you're playing too many colors in your deck, you would need to spread your mana sources more thinly. But the idea would be that no matter what card that you pull out of a booster pack, you would be able to put it into a deck if you wanted to. There aren't sort of hard faction splits like there are in something like Hearthstone, where there's a significant amount of the card pool that is limited to specific classes. There's still like the neutral cards that can go in any deck, but it's almost as if you could play, like if a deck was a blue deck, you could only play blue cards and you couldn't play blue and red cards. So this has this sort of counterweighting to this system where if you're putting, if you're trying to have a deck that gets access to many different types of abilities because they're limited based on the different colors of Magic, you are diluting your consistency in your deck to ensure to get access to sort of more varied strategies. Okay, so let's discuss the problems with mana, and I think that there are two really big ones. The one that everybody knows about is mana screw and mana flood, and this really is sort of the worst possible fail state of the land system, and the one that I think many games that try to sort of reinvent the land system try to solve. They're basically saying that these non-games aren't acceptable and we need to create a system that makes it so non-games can't happen. Now, Magic over time has created some sort of ways to alleviate some of these non-games to make sure they don't happen as often. Their mulligan system has changed over time, where initially you could only mulligan if you drew no lands or all lands, to the point now where you can mulligan kind of as many times as you want, and you must put a card back on the bottom of your deck after each time that you mulligan. So you can end up with a hand of no cards, but each time you're going to be drawing 7 to try to sculpt that hand and make sure you're going to have lands to play the game. The other things that they've done is that they've made it so that there are like dual face cards that work as mana or as a spell. But really the mulligan system, I think, in conjunction with the land system, is the thing that has kind of alleviated this problem for Magic. But non-games do still happen. The other big problem here that doesn't get talked about that much, but is kind of something that is able to be remedied within Magic systems, is that lands operate on a vector that other cards don't operate on. You can play a land and it doesn't require any mana, right? You don't pay mana to get more lands. You get an additional land as part of the turn structure of the game. And so when certain effects are put onto lands, it makes it so that those effects can be maybe too powerful when they are only limited by the fact that it's a land. You were basically giving up a land drop to get that ability. You could kind of think of it as like a game action, right? Like you have a land drop. That land drop can be spent to play a land, or if that land is giving you some kind of additional other effect, it's like you used that land drop to get that other thing instead. But the problem is that that cost is not particularly granular, and so it's difficult to balance lands based on that cost alone. And so often you'll see lands that have additional effects will have some kind of mana cost to alleviate the fact that, oh, well, the land drop doesn't cost me anything to put into play, but then to get the additional land effect, I must then pay the mana cost to do so. But really the lands that we see sort of problems with that heavily impact metas are the ones that don't really account for that as a cost, or try to do things that in theory would be difficult to achieve but ultimately end up kind of trivial. This would be things like Dark Depths and Lotus Field, where Dark Depths comes in with, I think it's 20 counters, and you have to sort of thaw out Merit Lage over time. But there are other cards that interact with counters to just sort of remove them all at once and get you a large creature into play immediately. And Lotus Field, when it comes into play, you're supposed to sacrifice some lands, and that can be turned on its head and used as sort of a benefit, right? As sacrifice effects often can be. Another factor with lands operating on kind of a different axis than all of the other spells in the game is that they are pretty difficult to interact with. So if a land has an effect, there is no way to like deal with that effect before it has already happened with something like a counterspell. Once it's come into play, all that you can utilize to affect that land is something like land destruction. So before we get into discussing what other games have done to try to alleviate some of these problems, let's first define what would be the sort of perfect solution here. The first thing is to address that the perfect resource system would have some amount of entropy added into the game that makes it so that players cannot always play optimally. I really do think the biggest problem is the non-games, rather than the fact that sometimes you will stumble and your opponent will stumble. The best version of this would be one in which you or your opponent could stumble but not have a non-game. The next criteria would be that there would be some kind of deck building tension that keeps your resources and the things that you want to play with those resources in contention with each other, which makes deck building much more interesting. We would want the system to solve the queen problem and hopefully solve it with some amount of granularity so that we have a wide spectrum of costs in the way to cost different effects on cards rather than it just being a single mana value. Hopefully we would be able to keep these other things, right? Solving the queen problem, a system of entropy, and tension in deck building, along with making it so that a fail state of a complete non-game wouldn't be possible. Okay, so let's take a look at some games and how they've attempted to remedy some of the mana system's biggest problems. And the first one is just giving players a consistent resource every turn. And we can look at something like Hearthstone. And so in Hearthstone, each turn you'll gain one mana crystal. So turn 1, you have 1, turn 2, you have 2, turn 3, you have 3. And then this just sort of moves you cleanly up the curve, and none of your cards in your deck are resource cards. You could play something that sort of gets you an additional mana crystal. I think Druid has a card that does that. In terms of you having hiccups in your mana resource, that has been eliminated from the game. You're alleviating the problem of non-games, but you're also throwing out any of that additional variance you'd get through the mana system. So games of Hearthstone can feel quite linear, and curving out because you're getting those resources is of sort of the utmost importance. The player who doesn't curve out is at a distinct disadvantage. Now, to Hearthstone's credit, early in its design history, they did focus on trying to reintroduce a bit of that randomness back into the game, and you can see it in the early card design, something like Arcane Missiles, but I think players noticed this a lot more than what you would with the mana system. I think it's more output randomness instead of input randomness. Those terms are a little fuzzy, but basically like input randomness is I know the randomness is already behind me before I'm making decisions, versus I'm making decisions and the outcome has some amount of randomness to them. The output randomness tends to be a bit more frustrating for players. Games that are strategically very deep do use output randomness, things like XCOM and Warhammer. So it's not that output randomness is a big no-no in strategy games. It's just that it gives the game a different sort of feel. So the other thing that with Hearthstone's mana system and their focus on streamlining the sort of mana here, they have removed that granularity in resource costs. So you see that cards have a single mana cost, and that's it. There's no sort of color differentiations. And so they've lost some of that granularity in how they can cost cards. They've tried to bring some of that back by using their sort of hard class systems with Rogue, Warrior, Priest, etc. to gate off cards so that you don't end up with like sort of one deck that just can do everything. This, again, in a similar way to that output randomness, I think makes it so that you're not necessarily getting the most out of your card pool and offering players an inclusive system rather than an exclusive system that says you can do whatever you would like, whatever you want, but it's going to cost you, right? That's sort of the difference between the systems. Hearthstone says you can't do whatever you want. You have to choose a class and then cards within that class, where Magic says you can do whatever you want. It's just going to be less consistent. Okay, next, let's take a look at pitch systems. These are systems where instead of drawing specific resource cards in your deck, you can turn kind of any card or a subset of cards in your deck into resources. This is something like Duel Masters originally kind of pioneered this system. Flesh and Blood has kind of a unique take on this, and the game that we're going to be focusing mostly on today is Lorcana. So in Lorcana, you can put a subset of cards that are inkable face down as a resource card. This feels like kind of a halfway point between what Magic's doing and something like what Hearthstone is doing, where Hearthstone is just, doling out the resources every turn. Lorcana still has some amount of tension within deck building because only some cards can be inkable. It's not every card. The other thing that Lorcana has done is that they do have distinct colors. I don't remember exactly what the colors are called. It's like steel, sapphire, stuff like that. Like they're sort of color associated as well. And in their system, they do have kind of a hard limitation of like you can pick two, and then the two colors are what you can combine in your deck. Pitch systems all kind of have this weird problem, which is that you have to choose a card in your hand that you could otherwise play and turn it into a resource. This was the big hurdle that they ended up facing with Duel Masters, which was also designed by Wizards of the Coast, which is that it just kind of felt bad to players that usually the sort of top tier, big, expensive card that you were trying to build up to, instead of playing it, you would end up turning it face down as a resource. Lorcana has even another wrinkle here that's a little bit strange, is that because only certain cards are inkable, you have to reveal the card that you're inking first so that your opponent can basically check to make sure that card can be inked, and then you put it face down, which turns known information into hidden information, and so players are inclined to want to try to track that, right? They want to write it down so that they'll know, it's less likely that they would have that card in their hand because they turned it into one of their inked cards. Oddly, to kind of combat this problem, Lorcana decided that you can't write notes down during tournaments. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Also has you can't write notes down. But what that does is that it incentivizes players to memorize what's going on. And memory is sort of like a physical skill kind of outside of the game systems. I'm not going to get too far into that here, but basically you're testing a skill that is sort of isn't necessarily part of the game systems, the skill of memorization. So now that's not necessarily a problem, but to me, it's just a little less clean than I would like it, in that instead of known information becoming hidden again, maybe it could be better if the card stays revealed. This was how Duel Masters handled it, is that you would play the cards face up, I think upside down, and then you'd turn them basically into a resource card. The other thing that Lorcana ends up missing by doing the system, Hearthstone as well, is that you are now giving up an amount of design space, right? That the cards that would be turned into resources now are cards that have to function as kind of like a regular card in the game. In Lorcana's case, in Hearthstone's case, there's no opportunity at all to sort of customize your mana crystals. But because there isn't sort of this additional vector to design sort of land cards, I think Lorcana could explore this territory at some point. I don't know. They added like locations, but I don't think they have anything to do with their resource system. But when you play them face down, right, you're revealing the back of the card, unless they allow some cards to be inked face up at some point. I don't know. Lorcana players, let me know if they've tried this out. But unless they do that, all of the inked cards are just inked cards, and that's all they do, right? They're face down. You see the back of the card. The back of the card, I guess theoretically, doesn't have functionality to it. Also, in a similar way, Lorcana has kind of given up some of that granularity in their cost systems, where similar to Hearthstone, where they've separated effects into specific colors instead of classes. But at least in Lorcana, you can choose 2 to combine together. It'd basically be like in Hearthstone if you could choose a Death Knight and a Rogue, and now you can build a deck with those 2 card pools combined. But you're still not getting the granularity that you are out of Magic, where the cost of the cards doesn't have that multiple color pips idea. It's that they are just separated into different colors, and they are a single cost. One thing I will say about Lorcana's resource system is that they are still maintaining some amount of that system of entropy, right? Because only certain cards can be turned into ink. And so your deck is sort of required to play a certain percentage of inkable cards, and the cards that aren't inkable get to be slightly more powerful because they're not. But it really is just an on-off switch here, right? In that if they made too many powerful cards that are inkable, there's almost no reason then to play cards that can't be inked because it's just a liability. Okay, and the last type of resource system we're going to look at is a separate resource deck system. And this is kind of in line with Hearthstone, but instead of them being just mana crystals, think of it as like you could customize those mana crystals, but then they're in their separate deck that you're drawing from each turn. Riftbound uses this system. They kind of have an interesting, you get 2 runes every turn, and their rune decks are finite. I think it's 10 total. And then some costs, you'll put runes back into your deck and draw them again. But the game we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look at is Sorcery. And Sorcery has like 2 distinct decks, right? They have their Atlas deck and they have their spell book. And at the beginning of the game, you draw 3 cards from your Atlas deck and you draw 3 cards from your spell book. I think it's 3. These 2 decks are sort of like in direct interaction with each other during gameplay, and you customize your Atlas deck and your spellbook the same way that you would any other deck. It's basically like if you just pulled the mana out of Magic and put them in their own deck, so you have 2 decks. While this system is a bit inelegant, it does solve quite a few of the problems with mana, right? You do have a tension between the resource cards and the cards that win you the game still, but you're just sort of deciding which of those you want to draw. And so it's not a tension in deck building, it's a tension in what I'm using my draw for the turn to actually acquire. And so often you see kind of a play pattern of, well, I need to hit a certain number of lands for my deck's strategy, and then I can stop drawing from my Atlas deck and instead draw from my spellbook. That does still retain the sort of curving out problem, right? Where you are reliably going to be hitting your resource cards, and you don't have those sort of hiccups in the curve of playing, a 1 mana spell, 2 mana spell, 3 mana spell. But this system does allow you to keep that distinct design of land cards, because the cards themselves in the Atlas are played face up, and they have additional effects like land cards do in Magic. So yeah, I think the biggest drawback there is just that it doesn't, the sort of system of entropy that would normally be in place, where you are required to respond to the variance that the decks are providing, is lessened. It's still there because you are drawing different types of locations from your Atlas deck, and those locations are in conjunction with a color threshold system. They have earth, fire, air, and water in Sorcery. And certain spells require you to meet thresholds of having enough of each type of those resources. I do think that Sorcery system, I still think that the thing that it's mostly missing is the elegance from Magic's mana system and that system of entropy to make sure that you're introducing randomness into the curve of your game plan. But it does retain the granularity, and it does retain the design space for the cards. So yeah. I think currently the Sorcery system is interesting, but having 2 decks is a bit weird for me. I would like there to I would like to be able to find a system that keeps the deck building tension as well and keeps things elegant with only having a single deck. But what do you think? Have you played any other games that you think handle resource systems better and solve the problems with the mana system while retaining its best attributes? Let me know in the comments your thoughts. If you're working on a game and would like to join a community of game designers, you can join our Discord. The link's in the description. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.